Well, good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I'm Kelly Bourne, Executive Director of the Cyber Policy Center here at Stanford University, and I'm glad to be joined today for this conversation about race and technology by three experts in this field, by Julia Wono, who's the Executive Director of Internet Sans Frontières, a digital rights advocacy organization based in France. Julia is also a member of Facebook's Oversight Board, which has been much discussed in recent months, and an affiliate of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, and also at Stanford's Digital Civil Society Lab here on the West Coast. We're also joined by Mitali Nkonde, who is also a fellow at the Digital Civil Society Lab here at Stanford, as well as a member of the recently announced TikTok Advisory Council and the CEO of AI for the People, and also by Safia Nobel, who is the author of Algorithms of Oppression and an associate professor at UCLA in the Departments of Information Studies and African American Studies. So it's great to have a panel with many women on it. For background, before we jump in, and for those who aren't familiar with the Cyber Policy Center, all of our research and teaching focuses on the governance of digital technologies when it comes to questions around security, geopolitics, and democracy. And we are home to about a half dozen programs, and all of our research and teaching is really focused on informing the policy agendas for governments, tech companies, civil society, and academia globally when it comes to these questions of how best to govern our digital technologies. And we host these webinars every other Wednesday at 10 a.m. and always in collaboration with colleagues from other universities and think tanks around the world. Today's is in collaboration with the Digital Civil Society Lab here at Stanford. And so before jumping into a bit more background on the topic and turning it over to our panelists, I was going to ask Toussaint Natias, who's the Associate Director of Research at the Digital Civil Society Lab, to share a couple of remarks about the work that they're doing in this space as well. Toussaint, if you're with us.
Sure. Thank you so much, Kelly. First of all, I want to say that I'm extremely grateful to Kelly and the team at the Cyber Policy Center for putting together this fantastic lineup on this urgent topic. As you said, I'm Toussaint Natias. I'm the Associate Director of Research at the Digital Civil Society Lab. And the lab investigates the challenges and opportunities for civil society to thrive in a digitally dependent world. Connecting research and practice is at the core of what we do. And one of the main ways we do so is through our Practitioner Fellowship program. This fellowship is a collaboration with the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. And the goal is to provide support to social sector leaders as they develop ideas to benefit civil society. We're extremely proud that two of the speakers tonight, Julia Wono and Mitali Nkonde, are currently fellows with us at the lab. We're inspired by their work in advancing debates at the intersection of racial justice and technology. And to see them in dialogue with a past-breaking scholar like Professor Noble is a perfect example of the type of cross-sector engagement that we believe is so urgently needed in the current moment. And so with that, I'll hand it back to you, Kelly. Thank you so much again for making the conversation happen, and enjoy, everyone. It's going to be fantastic.
Great, thanks, Toussaint. And between you and Julie, we have much better accents on this call than we normally do. So before jumping in and turning it over to the panelists, thought it would be helpful to provide a little bit of context about the discussions we've been having at the Cyber Policy Center around the intersection of race and technology and challenges there. And I would broadly group them into four main areas of concern, though I think no doubt our panelists will have much more to add to that. But we are seeing challenges around race and technology when it comes to online harassment, racially targeted disinformation, invasive technologies, and then the use of biased algorithms to inform decision-making with increasing regularity. And so just to speak quickly to each of those, on the topic of online harassment, we know from recent surveys from the Anti-Defamation League that race-based harassment is reported by 30% of Hispanics or Latinos, 27% of African Americans, and 20% of Asian Americans online. When we look at disinformation, we know that this is a significant area of focus by both foreign actors and domestic actors. So looking just at the Intelligence Committee's report from the Senate after the Russia interference in 2016, for example, my colleague Renee DiResta here at the Cyber Center, who co-authored the Senate's report, found that no single group of Americans was targeted by internet research agency by Russia's information ops more than African Americans. They found that race-related issues were by far the preferred target of Russia's information warfare campaign in 2016. They found that more than 66% of Russia's Facebook ads contained terms related to race, and that 96% of YouTube content was targeted at racial issues and police brutality. So this is a significant theme when it comes to online disinformation. We're also seeing increasing concerns about the invasive technologies like facial recognition software used for profiling and at protests, electronic ankle monitors, and other technologies that can be racially exploitative. And then finally, we're seeing increasing reliance on algorithms to inform people's decision-making across sectors and repeated reports of bias in those algorithms. Judges using racially biased algorithms to inform prison sentencing, landlords screening tenants based on racially biased algorithms, employers using algorithms to hire that are racially biased, including Amazon, which had also been found to have gender bias, and then loan officers screening potential loan recipients based on problematic algorithms. So many different ways in which race and technology intersect that are proving concerning. And so on that note, I want to turn it over to our panelists. Just two last points. We will be recording this webinar so that we can post it on our site. And if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A. I will do my best to moderate those. We're going to have each of the panelists speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll save about 30 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to start with Mitali, and Mitali, ask you to discuss your concerns around how technologies are affecting all aspects of racial discrimination and how racial literacy in tech, and based on the conversations that you and I have had, can really help understand movements like Black Lives Matter from their launch all the way through to how they are driving positions like defund the police. Then Safia, I would love to turn to you to talk first about some highlights from your book, Algorithms of Oppression, which I really appreciated traced the entire value chain of technology and its impacts and intersections with race. Everything from the supply chain for microchips to search engines, showing results that are exploitative to minority women, to hazardous conditions for disposing of these technologies. And then time permitting, I really appreciated your new article that explored the possibility of restoration and reparation from big tech, and would love to hear from you how you can imagine tech companies, constructively contributing to the social good. And then from there, Julie, would love to hear how you are thinking about tech companies and their negative impacts on society actually being disadvantageous to their bottom line, and how we can think about the impacts that these companies are having on communities and democracies, and how we can think about the potential negative financial impacts of them not solving these problems. So Mitali, we'll start with you, and then we'll proceed from there. Thanks. Oh, I think you're muted.
And I'm in a tech seminar and don't know how to use Zoom. So this is a great start, but thank you for that kind introduction, Kelly. And thank you to the whole Stanford community who have not just been supportive of me within the Digital Civil Society Lab, but across campus. So I'm going to start very quickly using storytelling, because that's really the skill set that I bring to this field. And I invite us to think about the idea of racial literacy through tech, through the story of George Floyd. So not that slide or even those. I'm going to stop share and share from the beginning again. Just bear with me 1 second. But what I'm attempting to do is to really be able to use these slides. They're not going to play, so I'm going to go backwards to go forwards. But really inviting us to look at this idea of racial literacy in tech through the lens of George Floyd. So on May 25th of this year, an African-American man called George Floyd is arrested for allegedly passing a counterfeit $20 bill in a store in Minneapolis. This picture is taken upon arrest, but after an interrogation with one of the officers, 8 minutes and 46 seconds after a knee is placed on his windpipe, Floyd passes. He's lynched. We see him die. At the moment of transition, we hear him call for his mother. Floyd was there because he had cash. He didn't have credit. We don't know whether he had access to credit, but those of us that sit and live at the intersection of race and technology know that the algorithmic decision-making systems that let us know whether or not we will be given credit are biased against Black people. And so I lean in for many reasons, but that being one. This sparks nationwide protests. In this picture, you see people, Black and white, holding up signs that are saying, Black Lives Matter. One, in fact, says for all lives to matter, we have to also agree that Black Lives Matter. And that becomes a persistent theme over that summer. Again, this is an algorithmic story as much as it is a humanitarian disaster in my view. And so we see elements of the far right. Look at what's happening online, look at hyper engagement, and start to engage. This is the Boogaloo Nation, Boogaloo Nation, I did get that correct, who are a far-right group who are trying to incite race war, but they come in amongst these crowds really, really trying to insert their narrative. Excuse me for just 1 minute. I have a noisy child, so hopefully you can't hear too much. The police then are also incited by this. So this is actually a picture of what looks like police violence, but there were many incidents where people in police forces took the knee and were conciliatory, but this also becomes a campaign. And this idea of police brutality goes through from George Floyd, but is a much older story. It's a story that starts really at the founding of America, where enslaved Africans are come and they're met with this idea of control and force. And it's really what birthed what we now know as the Black Lives Matter movement. But there is a policy demand. It's not just marching in the streets. It's not just people playing online trickery with algorithms. There is also a policy demand. And out of that comes this idea that we can defund systems that do not serve all of us. In this case, we're looking at African Americans, and the police being a central focal point of one of many systems that really stops Black people fulfilling their full potential. And then again, because I sit at the intersection of race and technology, technology shows up. IBM, Microsoft, Amazon quickly make statements to say that they will no longer sell facial recognition units to police forces in the United States. But there's a complication, because at the same time, they're lobbying on the state level to have facial recognition bills be either watered down or thrown out. And in the case of IBM, they're not actually a big player in that marketplace. So we do have to take this with a note of cynicism. We saw many companies making statements around Black Lives Matter, but the truthfulness of it is that is not the way that they were treating Black employees in-house. So the New York Times does what they do. I love their investigative reporting, and they use geolocation data and come out with this idea that Black Lives Matter may be the largest social movement in US history. And they do this using location data throughout June, and find on June 6, 50 million people I keep saying 50 million people, this is fake news. It should say 500,000 people. And 50,000 unique places across the United States have uploaded to various social media platforms that they're at the Black Lives Matter protests. So here is this story of the death of one man, which is like many other deaths, but there is this huge burgeoning. And we should say this is after COVID. So we've been home for 3 months and want to get out. So in 2019, along with incredible colleagues, Jesse Daniels, a sociologist at the CUNY Graduate Center, and Dirk Mayer, who is a computer scientist at the University of Bucknell, we get together with Howard Stevenson. So for those of you that recognize the Stevenson name, Howard Stevenson is the older brother of Brian Stevenson, who was the founder of the lynching museum in the South and the protagonist in the movie Just Mercy. And when we meet with Stevenson at UPenn, he really brings us into this idea of racial literacy being a skill set that not just white people can learn to learn about Black people, but Black people can learn so that we can then lean into what we're thinking about as more fair, just, and equitable futures. And the framework has three elements. The first is cognitive. So this idea that, as noted scholar Cornel West always says, race matters. Being Black in America, being Black in the United Kingdom, where I grew up, has implications to your life chances. In this case, the implications of Floyd being Black is that he becomes part of this lethal tradition that goes from policing in the antebellum South through to police violence on Black bodies, which we're all seeing today. As we sit in this seminar, we're still waiting for news from Louisville, Kentucky around the Breonna Taylor case. Another aspect of this cognitive understanding of race and understanding of the implications of race is that modern policing is a technological project. So for those of us that look to Michelle Alexander's work to really understand policing and the carceral state, we know that the federal government provide funding to municipal police departments for technological tracking and identification of suspects. We also know, as in some of my own work, I'm working on a book project at the moment that is looking at using freedom of information requests to look at how the NYPD fund, and then we have this dark money, we have benevolence funds who can gift technology to the police. So when you come up against the police, there's this asymmetry of power where you have the technological state that controls Black bodies and then the bodies that are being controlled. The other part of this framework is emotional. So this idea that race is difficult to talk about. And when we, in our ethnography, we found that when specifically engineers were asked about race, the first thing they said, I voted for Obama. Whether they voted for Obama was not part of our questioning regime, but we found through our analysis that it was linked to other parts and conversations that were just about being, I'm not racist, I don't want to talk about this, I voted for Obama, I'm not racist. The other second thing that came out of our research, but we see this steeped in the literature, particularly we were looking at people like Eduardo Berna Silva, and this idea of color blindness is that race is political. Race has power. I've talked about it briefly above, but in the emotional sense, there was this idea that by acknowledging the humanity of the Black body, that you are not acknowledging or somehow taking away from the validity of whiteness. And that really wasn't what we were trying to control, but it was certainly a really interesting finding. And then the third thing, which was always most fun for me and why I was so glad to have a white co-author so that we could advance this piece in many cases, was this complete shutdown when we start to talk about this notion that race mattered and that technology itself is a product of a racialized society. And that's something I know that my conversants are going to dig into much more deeply. So the third part of this idea of racial literacy and how it's played out in this situation is, in order to move towards a racially literate future, we need to have a plan. We need to have an action plan. So one of the things in terms of the action plan and in my work, which really sits at the intersection of race and technology, but we're using arts and culture to promote these messages, are this idea that we move away from the tech is neutral narrative. We also move away from, oops, we made a mistake, we didn't know, oh no, and towards this idea that technological projects through their inception, whether at the design, the deployment, or the governance stage, are racialized and gendered products. They will land differently depending on your identity status. So making sure people understand that. The other thing, and this really comes through some more recent work, over the summer, I became a key constituent to the UN 3C Table to AI, which is an advisory group that sits outside the Secretary General's office that's looking at this roadmap to AI that they're creating. And it introduced me into the idea of using human rights in a way that I have never been open to before. I'm a famous critic that human rights seem to be human rights of everybody unless they're Black. But I have been given faith. Really theorists, African theorists that I'm in conversation with now have really renewed my faith in this idea of disparate impact and using human rights frameworks to regulate our technologies through this idea that if they are found to have a disparate impact on any marginalized group, that I'm looking through race and gender, but it could be other lenses, it could be ability, it could be homophobia, it could be any number of ills, that our action plan should be to undo this. So I know Sophia can speak for herself, and I'm so looking forward to this, but Sophia and I had worked on a content moderation bill in Congress last year, and one of the things that actually came out of those discussions were this idea that we would have to measure impact in policy. That particular proposal didn't go where we needed it to go, but when the Justice of Policing Act came up, they used our statute, Sophia, so we should be, we're kind of sort of in a little tiny way, had contributed to some of the thinking around that. And that's what racial literacy as a framework could look like in a post-George Floyd universe. So again, very briefly, so that I can give time for my colleagues, it's this idea that we cognitively have to understand the importance of race in society, not necessarily in technology yet, but there is an importance, and technological development sits within this society. The idea that it's going to be difficult, that there is going to have to have work to move people away from the very the instinct to say they voted for Obama, or even the instinct to shut down, and for us to discuss how race is a political and a technological project. And then from a regulation standpoint, which is where I'm very interested in regulation. My work at TikTok is really looking at policy. My work within Congress is really looking at policy, and not just in the 116th, actually actively looking for partnerships as we go into the 117th. And we have been asked to do some of the work that we did prior. So I'm pretty sure that was more than 5 minutes. I tend to be an over talker, but I am going to yield my time.
This is great. Thank you, Mitali. And now can we turn to you, Safia?
Sure. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to get to participate in a panel like this with Mitali and Julie. And I think I will try to be extra short because I really wanted to hear and learn from Mitali and Julie in this panel too. You know, a decade ago when I was working on my research that eventually turned into the book Algorithms of Oppression, it was very difficult to have these kinds of conversations. You know, there wasn't a global community of people who were doing this work. In fact, I was joking around on Twitter this morning with Professor Andre Brock at Georgia Tech, who's a good friend and colleague, and about all of the people who had influenced our work. And so even that so many people might pick up this thread in the very contemporary moment about the harms and exploitation that come through a variety of digital engagements, propositions, projects. It really has been a long conversation that has been informed by so many people. And I just want to, pay homage to our kind of intellectual ancestors of primarily, people of color, women and LGBTQ scholars and journalists who have done so much work that would lead us to a moment like today where we could have, let's say, a blockbuster hit on Netflix called The Social Dilemma. But, we know that that can't happen without the decades of critique that really I think of and kind of characterize as, women of color, people of color, white women, LGBTQ people, again, kind of being the canaries in the coal mine. And so I think that, with that as kind of an opening, I'll just say that, there's an entire broader digital or technological landscape that I've, really tried to think about in my own work. Of course, the book was about talking, maybe specifically about Google, because when you write a dissertation, as students know, you need to have a site of intervention or a case to study. But I really wanted that to be illustrative of the entire sector. And of course, when you take on, for example, the monopoly leader, you're in a better position to kind of of articulate the paradigm that you're in. And so this was really the reason for studying Google. But of course, I could have looked at Microsoft or Facebook or, any number of companies to see how exploitation and harm was happening in their platform or in their technologies. As I see it, we've had such a narrow cut in on the way we even frame race and technology. I mean, in the early kind of Web 1.0 era, we really focused a lot on representation because representation was so important and misrepresentation was present then. I'm thinking of Lisa Nakamura's early work, for example, on cyber typing, menu-driven identities, right? The kind of very narrow conceptualization of people of color, all the way through now to, in the contemporary moment and in the future, predictive analytics that are predicated upon kind of a politics of classification. And that in fact, we've moved from, let's say, an era of recognition or representation to an era of classification and really trying to get those classifications stable. Unfortunately, the underlying logics of the ideologies of race, the social constructions of race are being attempted to be stabilized and naturalized. Right. So I think this is one of the dimensions, Mutali, as I listen to your work and think about the kinds of racial literacies we need, it includes that we understand the degree to which these ideologies are kind of more and more naturalized, made concrete, and therefore quite difficult to intervene upon. So we have so much work to do. And I guess when I think about, the entire supply chain, from extraction of minerals and, the way in which extractive technologies and projects have worked on the continent of Africa for a very long time in other places like Australia, South America, even in the United States. We have to factor that part, of course, into the digital, because, of course, so many people think of the digital as being kind of a white-collar Silicon Valley imaginary, or living in the realm of software and hardware, and really never taking the time to think about the kind of neo-colonial imperialist ways in which the entire system is propped up by very old and recognizable patterns. So I think this is something that's important. Of course, we can take that through into manufacturing. We can take that through in terms of exploitation in consumption, which I think might be the register that so many more of us are used to thinking about, which is like this idea of content, content being, of course, a really, to me, in many ways, I have this conversation with my colleague, Sarah Roberts, all the time, content really being a word that flattens our understanding of everything from evidence-based research and facts through to propaganda and racist disinformation and hate speech, that it all gets called content. And of course, that's one of, I think, the racial projects of Silicon Valley is to obscure and deny responsibility for this kind of nuanced landscape. And of course, we can go beyond the US and we can go beyond Europe and the way that we think about content, trolling, all kinds of harm, to waste. Where does the device go when we're done? Well, I spent a couple of summers ago, I spent time in Accra, Ghana, looking at a formerly pristine wetland in the heart of the city that's been turned into a huge kind of toxic dump. That includes waste from the West or the global North. And so I think we have a lot of the material dimensions of the digital that we want to bring into the way that we talk about race and racism, but more importantly, the way we talk about global social inequality and exploitation. I've been writing about this, and I'll just say that, we'll get a link dropped in here. What are the possibilities for restoration and repair? And I'm happy to kind of talk about that in the Q&A just to make sure there's plenty of time for Julie. But, we have to talk about accountabilities for harm. And we have other models of doing that. And so, my current work at the Center for Critical Internet Inquiry at UCLA is really with our teams there thinking about what would restoration and reparation look like from big tech. And of course, that has to include looking at things like the offshoring of profits, the lack of tax paying, taking the cream of the crop of the best students, the best resources, using our public infrastructures. And of course, at a time like COVID-19, we see what the divestment, in fact, from the public has done through the tax evasion to crumble our systems that we're so desperately reliant upon right now. So maybe I'll leave it there. And of course, we know that those systems are racialized and gendered too. And we know who's being most negatively impacted, in every sector of society, health, education, and so forth. So I think thinking in these systems ways about structural racism and the ways that they're manifest through digital technologies, but the entire tech industry is really, an important place to look to.
Safia, thank you so much. Julie, do you want to share some remarks?
Yes, Kelly, thank you so much, first of all, to the Center for the invitation. And I'm super honored again to be on this same panel with two exceptional women that I've been admiring for the past years. I completely agree with all that has been said by Brutality and by Safia. And what this makes me, I think what this makes us realize is that definitely racism has become, I don't want to say has become, but it is a vulnerability by design of our internet, of our digital world. And as a vulnerability, it either, contaminates the whole network, the whole industry, the whole people who are working on that, and it also can be weaponized and used by malign actors. You said rightly, Kelly, at the introduction that a report by Renee DiResta showed that African Americans were the most targeted by disinformation in the U.S. But I think it's important to have this idea of vulnerability of the network in mind, because we're talking about an interconnected network with definitely interconnected challenges and consequences. So when I say that, I'm trying to invite us all, like Safia has rightly said before, to look at things, at the big picture, to look at the big picture and understand this interconnectedness. When we say African Americans are targeted by disinformation, by Russians who are using, a problem, a societal problem that has been plaguing the country for such a long time, but they're also using resentment that does exist in other parts of the world, in the complicated relationship that the Western world has had with the rest of the world, and particularly with the African continent. So understanding that, the conclusion for me can only be that this interconnectedness should lead to interconnected solutions and collaborations. I really insist on that, because that for me, that's one of the solutions, along with others that have been mentioned. And when I say that, I guess what I'm trying to say is, if the solution is not the solutions around, or the thoughts about interconnectedness and globality are not integrated in how tech designers or even tech advocates like myself work on this network and work to make sure that this network remains an equalizer and does not become a tool of oppression. It's important to bring to the table other actors from other places of the world. That's one thing. The other thing is that I think really there is an urgency now for tech companies to understand this and to act. It's not only a moral, it has become beyond a moral problem. It's not just that it's bad to be racist, it's really bad. But for a company, I guess one of the languages that they also understand is that it makes them lose money. We are aware of debates at the moment at the EU level, for instance, that the EU wishes to better regulate privacy, or at least better protect the privacy of the EU citizens. And we're also aware that that same privacy, or at least those same data of European Union citizens, have been used and have been weaponized by malign actors who have used those tech tools to cause havoc, or at least to destabilize democracies in the EU. And today we're at a point where companies are even threatening to leave the EU market. I mean, I think it's an interesting time, because having companies ready to put on the table so much shows the extent to which this debate is so important, and it does, it has become a question of profits and a question of competitive advantage for these companies. I'll give another example a bit further south of the Mediterranean, where, as you know, disinformation and hate speech also have devastating effects on African societies, and especially in societies that are more fragile, that have more fragile institutions, and that are suddenly flooded with these tools, whose in effect we know they can have positive ones, of course. Otherwise, for instance, I always like to say I personally wouldn't be here, but they also do have negative effects, which are overshadowing the good at the moment. But the danger today is that the companies that are coming with their products are coming just with in mind the idea of scaling. I don't think they ask themselves at one point in the conversation before going to these countries, what are we going to do? How are we going to make sure that our tools are not used to commit violence or to violate human rights on a continent that, struggling with these issues, and particularly issues around freedom of expression, and hate speech, particularly. They're not asking themselves these questions, but this is becoming a danger for them, I think, because we're talking also about a continent on which governments have taken the habit of shutting down the internet simply whenever they're faced with a problem. And right now, hate speech and disinformation are problems. The recent example that I can give is Ethiopia, where almost 2 months ago now, the government decided to shut down the internet at the same time when they were very tense. It was a very tense political moment with death, after complicated relationship between communities in this country. And that hate was incited using Facebook, WhatsApp, to a certain extent, Twitter. Exactly the same pattern as we had seen in Myanmar, but absolutely no lesson has been taken from that sad example. So one of my arguments now is to tell these platforms, if you don't put in the same energy to fight hate speech, disinformation, and all the negative effects of your platforms before coming to these markets that have, again, fragile societies. Well, if you don't put the same energy as you put in the US, in Europe, although it's we can discuss, again, the extent of these efforts, but they're definitely more important than the ones that are deployed when these platforms operate elsewhere. If you don't do that, well, your platforms will continue to be shut down. Right now, a trend that started as government shutting down the whole internet, they don't even bother anymore. Now they just shut down Facebook, WhatsApp, and Twitter, Instagram, and this problem is solved. It will continue if the problem continues. But in the meantime, like I say, nature abhors the void. When you're not there, there are other platforms that are offering or trying to offer more or less the same tools and the same services. And they have the advantage, at least from the perspective of more of governments that, on the one hand, want to deal with disinformation, hate speech that they themselves also participate in, but also, on the other hand, are repressive and want to regain control on a space that they have lost control on. They're tempted to turn towards platforms that are offering the guarantee of that control. And by doing so, obviously, these companies, Facebook, Google, we know they have been investing, and they're still investing a lot of money to connect the next billion, including on the African continent. But what's the point of investing that much when your platforms can be shut down from one day to another? Because you haven't dealt with the problems the very problems that your platforms are causing. So I'm not saying that this is not to say that platforms should collaborate with governments, obviously not, especially repressive ones, but it's rather for me a call to this platform to tell them, if you, before going to a country, before going to a continent, make sure at least that you know where you're putting your feet into. Don't just think you're going to come and disrupt. You're going to disrupt, but for the bad and for the worst. And it's going to backlash, not only on you, but also ultimately, I think, and that's probably a matter for another debate, ultimately on the societies where you come from, on Western societies. The good example is surveillance. For a long time, companies have been selling, European, American companies have been selling bad products to markets where there was no regulation and, where they could test whatever they wanted. But these same companies are coming back with the same products that have been tested and that have been perfected and that can be used against population in the Western world. So yes, I probably will leave it there, but I think the main ideas are, it's important to be aware of these impacts for companies. It has become a question of market. If we have to speak their language, I think that's the one. But to do so, there needs to be proactivity, and the proactivity is only possible when you're in good faith, and I insist on that. Work with experts in these countries, in these continents, that can tell you, that have the best knowledge ever you will find on earth on what their societies look like, what are the challenges that they're facing, and will probably provide you ideas on how to make your tool become again a platform that empowers and that that respects human rights. And last but not least, my colleague Mutale mentioned the human rights framework, and I think this is so important, especially at this moment. At the Oversight Board, this is really at the heart of the work that we will do. How to embed this human rights framework in the discussions around and in policymaking around content moderation for what we are concerned about. But also beyond that, how can we make sure that human rights become the principle and not the exception that we think about once the damages are being done? Guess that's where I will stop, and I look forward to the conversation.
Great, Julie, thank you so much. And I've really appreciated, Safia, you really broadening the conception of harms to not just content, but the entire sort of value chain of production and waste. And Julie, to you, broadening the conversation beyond the US to how this is playing out, in particular in authoritarian regimes, as we're experiencing these internet shutdowns. And then Mutale, your points about how do we ensure that technologists really understand the racial and gendered impacts of their products. So thank you all for that. We have some questions coming in, and others who have questions, please feel free to go ahead and add them. I wanted to start, you guys have broadened, the topics of concern substantially, and would love to hear, so I'll plant a seed with you, and then there was one specific question that came in that I can just quickly answer from someone. But, if you were to just narrow it to the 2 or 3 biggest concerns on your mind right now, and the 2 or 3, interventions that you would suggest from platforms or from policymakers to address them, I'd be really curious, because I think at times we in this community get bogged down with just the sheer magnitude of the problems that we're grappling with and where to begin. So would love to get your sense of priorities there, if that's possible. And then while you are thinking about that, I will quickly address one question that came up, which was a request to explain how facial recognition is racially biased when its job is really just pattern matching. And is there more to it than that? And would welcome panelists also to weigh in here. But my understanding is there was a recent MIT study I had read that showed that there were 34% error rates for dark-skinned women in facial recognition technologies, which was 49 times higher than what they were experiencing with white men. There was a Commerce Department study, I believe, also that had found African-American error rates to be 2 orders of magnitude higher than those with Eastern Europeans, which had the most accurate testing, and that this really is just a function of how these algorithms are trained. and that they are trained predominantly, developed by Caucasians, trained on Caucasian images. And if you were deploying these algorithms in China, they have much better technologies in China for identifying Asians than they do for Caucasians. So it's a function of how they're trained. But that the primary concern is sort of at the intersection of the technologies themselves and their faults around accuracy and recognition, and the way that they're being deployed if you are allowing police to use them for profiling or things like that, that's when it becomes particularly problematic. So I hope that answers that question. I don't know if anyone, Julie, Matalia, or Safia, you would chime in more on the facial recognition front, but then would just love to hear out of, all of this, the sea of challenges around race and technology, what your priorities would be.
So as far as I'm concerned, the facial recognition question has been addressed. So I will add a couple of priorities and then hand off to the mighty women on the panel. But I would say that for me, and Dr. Noble really pointed to this, was this idea that this is a systemic problem, because in our research, our biggest issue, whether we're speaking to engineers at Silicon Valley firms, as we were in advancing racial literacy in tech, or policymakers, was this idea that I voted for Obama, meaning it was this kind of interpersonal, I personally am not racist, therefore the products I personally work on will not be racist, and really turning that and realizing that within technical infrastructure, if we're using zip code, for example, as an input to get population data for product development purposes, what you're also doing is bringing forth the racist history of redlining into that. And if you don't understand that housing, it became a racialized product through the federal government from 1934 through to the Fair Housing Act of 1968, where basically what government was doing was deciding which areas can be invested in, and they had green lines and they would artificially invest in those areas, versus which areas will be divested from, which were red lines. So I live in a red line community, but it even goes beyond this divestment over if a generation is 15 years, so you're looking at 3 generations of divestment, to if you go into the very covenants of those housing developments, Long Island is close to where I live here in New York State, and the developers could not get bank loans if they were going to sell to African Americans, and then the people that bought the houses also had to sign that they would not sell to African Americans, because there was this idea that housing and investment and growing tax bases were to remain a property were to become an element of whiteness, were to become a property of people who are racialized as white. And so my concern is once we move people to the systematic, that's when, from a racial literacy perspective, we can bring down the temperature. Nobody is calling you racist. What we're talking about are a web of systems that we also can have the power to deconstruct. So secondly, as I finish out, what are my 2 priorities? One is systematic thinking, which really can only come from the academy, right? We have to bring in these scholars, many of whom are Black, brown, and from minority communities, and we have to center their work. But then the second one is this idea of the imaginary. Certainly, when I was doing federal work in 2009, people could not believe of a day where we would regulate facial recognition. They just thought it was the most ridiculous thing. Then 18 months later, Black Lives Matter protests, defund the police, and then we see tech companies divesting from that market. But they didn't just divest and then tweet. What they did was that IBM wrote a letter to the Congressional Black Caucus and explained in the letter everything. I mean, I've just said, be systematic. Now I'm going to be petty for a moment and make it about me. But I was like, I was basically lightheaded, myself and others, trying to drive home this point. But because it came from the lips of industry, because it came from the clause of capitalism, the idea that we don't need to invest in this market, led to, create that runway for, in the Justice of Policing Act, saying that facial recognition should not be used in body cams. So the imaginary and systems thinking, and then I would love to hear from the others.
Thanks, Mitali. Other thoughts, Julie or Safia, on what you see as the biggest problems or potentially promising inventions?
Yeah, I just wanted to rapidly add something to what you eloquently put Kelly, about facial recognition and bias. I'd like to give this example from Chinese companies in 2018, I believe, who decided to invest in 2 African countries. I think it was Zambia and Zimbabwe, if I remember well, in facial recognition, so selling to the government's facial recognition tools, and explaining one of their rationale was, we don't know much about Black faces, and we want to fill that gap. We want to better understand what are the different features of African faces. So we are going to build our database by providing tools in those countries. So I think, ironically, it was complicated example because, of course, we know these 2 countries, and along with others on the continent, don't have sufficiently protective privacy regulations, or not at all. But it was interesting to see that to respond to a very, societal problem, systematic problem, the solution was, okay, we're going to test this horrible technology on populations that are not protected. So yes, I thought it was also interesting to put that in the conversation. In terms of what are the priorities, what has been keeping me up at night recently is this idea, again, I insisted on that again, this idea of building more bridges, not on the one hand, between governments and civil societies in the countries, but also companies and civil society, and even civil society among themselves. When I joined the Berkman Klein Center, my one of the reasons that I joined was, I hope that we will have way more connections between centers in the US or in Europe that are doing incredible research and that are advanced, connect them with researchers and experts in countries where many of the best scenario, science fiction, what we think can only be science fiction, when many of these scenarios are already a reality and are faced by people and activists and experts there, but that do not necessarily have the scientific vocabulary or the capability to explain, that are living those experiences. So that's one of the ways I think we can, first of all, have a better understanding, because I think it really comes down to that. Many don't understand what racism and technology are about today. So, and even including in the tech industry, or probably mostly in the tech industry. So it's very important to link those teams in the tech industry, and I will go even more specifically, the product teams. In my work, I have worked very long time with public policy teams in those companies, which are doing incredible work, and for many of them, it's a very difficult world. But what I understood coming to Stanford, actually, for my fellowship, what I understood is that if you want to get things done fast, and when you're working on preventing a genocide, time is very important. When you want to make things fast, you have to make sure to not only have access to policy teams, but also to product teams, who are they seem to be, sacred in those companies. So one of my work now is to make sure, yes, there are, interactions, more interactions, and a better integration of that local expertise in those countries by the product teams and by tech companies in general. I think it's essential. I'll give an example. Recently, France.
And then you have 3 more minutes for questions.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Anyway, I just wanted to say I'm working on creating more bridges between civil society, governments, and also companies, basically.
Thank you. Safia, did you have remarks on that? And then I have two more questions that I was going to try and fit in a lightning round, as I thought they were quite interesting.
I'll say the things that keep me up at night are the way in which big tech is really in collusion with authoritarian governments around the world, wittingly or unwittingly. And I think we have to really pay attention to the ways in which name brand and not name brand technologies are deeply implicated in the collapsing of democracies around the world, the rise of anti-Black, anti-ethnic, anti-religious, anti-LGBTQ communities. The speed and scale through which these technologies are working to fragment societies, undermine civil and human rights is staggering. And to think that the sector is not, in fact, working alongside and invested in by governments is to really not understand the way in which these technologies work as a kind of an extrajudicial arm of the state and do things that would be illegal for the state to do, but can be done through commercial and enterprises. So those are the things that keep me up at night, because I think we are facing extreme global inequality, and that is going to continue if we don't arrest that through public policy quickly. And climate change is only exacerbating these concerns, and these technologies will be used as mechanisms of containment for people who become refugees of climate change, which might in fact be Californians. So I think we need to be really thoughtful and think very big picture about what's at stake right now.
Dr. Noble, I think that's such an important point, and I have been likewise, our team has been very concerned about this sort of rise of digital authoritarianism, and have a conference, a 4-day conference on this topic. And so maybe I can ask my colleague, Michelle, it's on China, AI, and human rights. And maybe you could put that, Michelle, in the chat box. And I'll save 1 minute at the end just to speak to a couple of events that we have coming up. But I'm going to ask for, if I can, try and fit in 2 last questions that I really appreciated, and see if we can get a lightning round of answers. We'll do our best. One of them, Julie, really builds very nicely on the remarks that you were making about working across sectors. And it's from my colleague, Daphne Keller, looking at what are the institutions that you all see as the most capable of correcting or pushing towards correction of these issues. Daphne is a lawyer. There has been much done on the or many attempts on the regulatory front, but many of them don't actually address racial issues. Some might actually make them worse. And so is the right answer, she asks, to double down on legislation, or to try, and if so, in what countries, or to look at international human rights, boycotts, social or market mechanisms, something else? So if you have thoughts on, where should we be putting our energies, I think that's a great question. Another from my colleague, Alyssa Lewis, looking at Lyft and Uber and the sort of fight against rulings to make drivers employees. And are we does this fit, Safia, into your view about, just the general exploitation of these technologies and the sort of extractive economy that's being facilitated by technology? So we'll do our best to fit that into, if you have answers in 1 or 2 minutes, and then I'll move to close.
I'll say rapidly, thank you, Daphne, for the great question. I think it's a bit of a mix of everything. We are aware that governments are naively pretending that they're not fully aware of the extent of these problems. So it's important to engage them. That's something that we think is important. I would say including the most repressive ones, honestly. We've done that in several countries in Africa very successfully. So I think it's a field to invest as well. But obviously boycotting, we've seen Stop Hate for Profit, we've seen so many other examples. So it's a mix of everything, but definitely one of my motto is civil society has incredible knowledge and incredible solutions. We have seen so many of these challenges before, and we can speak to them.
I think I would just say that we need an abolitionist visionary around what some of these technologies are doing, in the way that we, in the United States once had so many politicians and everyday people arguing that we could not, in fact, have or build a country without a slaveocracy, without the enslavement of African peoples, without dispossession of lands of indigenous people. And we there were people who had the vision. They were not in the majority either, who worked very hard to shift the paradigm at the moral, ethical, and legal leverage points around the abolition of enslavement. And so I think that's a model to look to. I'm certainly looking to that in my own work. I think we've successfully taken on big tobacco, and we've created big paradigm shifts around big tobacco. There are other industries that we can look at, and certainly the industry right now that we're talking about has been deeply implicated in undermining the very notion of worker rights and labor protections by arguing, in fact, that it's better to gig and have no health care, right? And have total flexibility to the point that you have no rights and and the companies have no responsibility to you. So I think we've got to push back on the very active imaginary that the tech sector has, which is purely extractive as far as I'm concerned, and convincing us that it's indeed liberatory when it is not.
Thank you. Mitali, last thoughts?
I would agree with everything that's said, but then extend this to this idea of picking up on this idea of the imaginary that I started with in my last response, but also saying that we need new narratives, right? So even when tech has done wrong, if we look certainly to, I think it's called The Social Network, the movie on Netflix right now, but this idea that we didn't know.
Yeah, right? Tristman's movie, The Social Dilemma.
That one. So this idea that we didn't know, that can't be good enough, because again, just using racial literacy as a framework, the very first thing is that you should know. You should have cognitive awareness and curiosity of the world that you live in, and then have an imaginary in which Black lives truly do matter.
Thank you. Thank you all for your remarks. This has been really extremely broadening in the conceptions that I think many of us had about these problems. So thank you, and I hope we can continue this conversation. And thank you to my colleague Tracy, who put up the event that we are doing at Safia that really speaks to your point about authoritarian governments and AI and human rights. This will be, you can, I think, register where Tracy put it up, 4 days, 9 to 11 a.m. on the 29th of, so next week, and then October 1st, 6th, and 9th. I will quickly highlight a couple of other events that we have coming up, and if any of our panelists are able to answer any of the questions that were directed at them in the chat box, in somehow enlightening time, please feel free to do so. But most importantly, thank you all so much. And Julie, welcome to California. And here are the events that we have coming up. As I said, the one on digital authoritarianism, we'll do another on media literacy. And then the two that I would highlight that may be of really significant interest, the upcoming book by Ron Diebert at Citizen Lab on reclaiming the internet for civil society. We have an elections debrief the day after the election, so I am really excited to hear what our team has to say. Then a great conversation on antitrust and the tech platforms that Frank Fukuyama will help lead. And then we will have a half-day election debrief that will be a longer look at the elections in December. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, and stay well.